This video will conclude the lecture on Proverbs 1 through 9. The previous video left off with verse 7, which showcased reverence for the covenant God of Israel as the epitome of knowledge. And now we proceed to the closing quatrain of this opening lecture, namely verses 8 and 9 of chapter 1. Here we find the supreme wisdom imperative together with an incentive. The quatrain comprising verses 8 and 9 introduces several firsts for the book of Proverbs. With this first explicit imperative of the book, in verse 8a, the author invites the pupil to emulate the very trait most characteristic of a wise person, namely listening. Incidentally, if you're recalling verse 5, where we encountered something of a command form, namely adjussive, we wish to point out that what we have in verse 8 is an explicit imperative, not adjussive, which is an alternative command form. Consequently, verse 8 does in fact produce the first genuine imperative. Another first that we find here involves the identification of the sage's intended audience, namely sons, together with that audience's primary source of instruction, that is, the parents. While the writer addresses the reader as my son, we likely should view the sage as not limited to a literal parent, but speaking figuratively as well. Reference to son is consistent with custom in the ancient world, which gave privilege to boys as regards opportunities for education and eventual community leadership. It is significant in the patriarchal society of the sapiential author that here from the outset, mother is indicated together with father as a source of teaching. We find that in verse 8b. Soon Lady Wisdom will appear as another female instructor, and here we refer to Proverbs chapter 1, verse 20 and following. In addition, toward the end of the book, we find Lemuel's mother, Proverbs 31:1, and also the valiant woman, Proverbs 31:26, as significant examples or sources of wisdom. With a touch of realism, the sage counsels both receptivity in verse 8a, with the word listen, but also cautions against allowing an attitude of disdain to dull instruction's impact. Verse 8b. So the first prohibition appears there in the second half of verse 8, a prohibition against neglecting maternal instruction. Evidently, the tendency found among some youth today that may lead them to disdain parental advice is no modern innovation. To help incline a youth toward parental discipline and instruction, the incentive of adornment follows the instruction. And here we refer to verse 9. Such an attractional model for motivation will routinely characterize how the sage will seek to persuade. Here the attraction is positive, the appeal of a desirable decoration. At times the incentive will be negative, as the sage reveals harmful consequences in hopes of deterring the youth from a given course of action. An example of this is found in the pathetic consequences of inebriation that the sage outlines beginning in Proverbs 23, verse 29. We'll observe later that an exhortation to receptivity, such as the statement that opens verse 8, listen, my son, to your father's warning, such an exhortation to receptivity at times may operate as part of a summons, calling readers to attention and paving the way for more substantial teaching that follows. When we refer to a summons of this sort, we are indicating that that is not the primary teaching, but rather a calling to attention. It's an introduction. We'll call this alternatively a wisdom commendation, in contrast to actual wisdom content. By wisdom commendation, we'll be sending the signal that the sage is saying wisdom is something really valuable, but he won't be giving any particular wisdom within that commendation. He just says it's high value. Having said that, in the present case, that is, coming back to chapter 1, verse 8, this call to listen, which will resemble other wisdom summons, is not merely a preface to wisdom. It is not simply a wisdom commendation that will be followed by actual wisdom later, but itself constitutes the actual content of the wisdom message in this case. If you're interested in seeing another place where the call to listen constitutes actual wisdom content, I encourage you to check out Proverbs 4, verses 1 through 9. The fact that the sage has selected these two compositions, namely chapter 1, verse 7, together with 8 and 9, as premier exhibits of sapiential teaching to be showcased here at the outset of the book, this indicates that the command to be receptive toward those in leadership, especially one's own parents, forms a gateway to all other instruction. And here we are referring to verses 8 and 9. And the lone principle that serves to calibrate all subsequent sapience consists of this: reverence for the God of Israel. That is, verse 7. In conclusion, consider these thoughts. Appropriately, the book of Proverbs opens by disclosing its purpose. Not content with the prospect of offering a mere collection of sayings, the sage here in Proverbs 1 through 9, aims to form character, alike among the wise as among the naive. Professor Fox puts it succinctly: morality is the subject to be taught. Thus, this prologue profiles the wise as persons who will actively seize discipline of a sort which is consonant with morality. The naive, for their part, aided by wise instruction, will grow into perceptive navigators, thereby escaping the downward spiral of their native orbit. Though the array of forms available for a sapiential composition may vary, the epitome of wisdom will remain monolithic, namely, reverence for the covenant God of Israel. Grasping this, we gain all. Missing this, we exit empty-handed. The sage closes by identifying parents as escorts of the youth, guiding them into this wisdom, provided that the younger generation will be wise enough to respond to their instruction with receptivity.